fantastic to see so many of you here. And of course, when we talk a little bit about what the topic is going to be, I'm sure that's why you're here, because it's so absolutely current. I'm Dixie Anderson, the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. We're delighted to share this series with Kent District Library. Lindsay, thank you. KDL has been a wonderful partner with us, and we look forward to a long association with the library. Before I introduce Dr. Lopez, let me just mention a little bit about the World Affairs Council for those of you who might not be members or know much about us. We've been around since 1949, and all we do is educate people in our community here in Western Michigan about global issues and American foreign policy. We're part of a national system of almost 100 councils around the country that all do the same global education that we do. We're all 501c3s. We're all non-advocacy and nonpartisan. And we believe in civilized discourse, which we will do tonight. For our series called Give Peace a Chance, and I don't know, am I the only one that wants to start singing the Beatles song? Or am I truly dating myself? So, I have to take this because I don't want to miss some of the really, Dr. Lopez just has a marvelous background for what we're doing tonight. So you did see his bio, but I'm only going to point out a couple more things. Dr. Lopez has served on the United Nations panel of experts for monitoring and implementing the UN sanctions on North Korea. So of course, could we be any more current than this issue tonight? And I know since we had a little chat on the way over that Dr. Lopez expects to talk and take your questions about it. He's far too modest to mention this, but he is one of the world's experts on economic sanctions. And I am hoping that, since I heard on the news today that it looks like the United States might be putting some more sanctions on Iran, I would expect that perhaps Dr. Lopez will talk a little bit more about that too. He is also an expert on peace building, the United Nations, conflict resolution, and various peace-related issues. We've known Dr. Lopez for years and years. When he is a founding faculty member of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and that's how we have known Dr. Lopez. He's always come here through the Notre Dame Club as a Hesburgh lecturer. He did leave, though, in 2013 and went to the U.S. Institute for Peace in Washington, but he came back, and we're so glad that, not that we weren't thrilled that you were at the USIP, but it's so nice to have you back here close to us. And he is now back at the Kroc Institute and now a Hesburgh Professor Emeritus. So, Dr. Lopez is a dear friend of our council. I'm delighted to introduce him to you, and I know you'll enjoy it. Dr. Lopez.
I'm making noise as I come up, and I'm not going to do that. This is down at my side. Yes, there it is. Thank you. This is not meant to be a floor show to start with, like a comedy routine, but it looks like it has that potential. There we go. I hope this isn't too loud for you. I'm not sure I need a microphone, but let's do it that way. Thank you so much for coming. I want to make sure that, first of all, that I click this correctly. This is the problem when you invite an academic so maybe I'll do it this way. There we go. I didn't break it, I promise. Okay, just not strong enough.
Good and firm.
Good, okay, good, there we go. It's a problem inviting a peace guy to solve. My thanks to the good hosts here at the library. I said up to Dixie driving up, I mean, wow. What a fabulous, I mean, just even from the outside and obviously coming in the inside, what a fabulous resource. And thank you for hosting it here, because I think this is libraries in action for dealing with world affairs kinds of issues. I think I wrote to Dixie and Erica when they first contacted me and said we're going to hold it as a series in the library. I said, oh, that's interesting, because I think it was 1982 that I gave a keynote address at the American Library Association, which was being held in Indianapolis at the time. I can't remember if it was 82 or 83. All those, maybe some of you have this, all those years kind of go together. But it was the height of concern about renewed nuclear war and a height of concern about enemy making with the then Soviet Union. And the question was, can libraries be community resources for people to make their own decisions about some things, even about nuclear issues? So that was a great and marvelous time, and I realized how long it's been since, not that I've been in a library, but that I have been able to address an audience at a library. So I'm delighted to be here. As Dixie said, we go way back with the World Affairs Council, often being hosted at Aquinas College and with the Notre Dame Club of Western Michigan, and delighted that all those groups have cooperated, but most especially thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to try to keep my remarks as promised to about 30 minutes, so we have a good exchange back and forth about a series of issues, because it's a time where I think communities need to be highly engaged in the question of what is peace and how we get there. I'm pressing as strongly as I can. Oh, you have to be closer. You have to aim at the machine. Thank you. Yeah, should have known that long ago. Okay, we entitled this Challenges and Opportunities to Peace Building. Let me outline what I think are the 5 great challenges, and apologize to you for only really talking about 2, maybe 2.5. I think the first and most important is, what is the violence that peace, if it works, is supposed to help fix? And, you know, in a perfect world where we had about 2.5 hours tonight and we were serving beer and pretzels and wine and cheese, I'd put us all in groups of 5 or 6, have us get some refreshments and talk about, and maybe even reach a group consensus on what is the violence that we're here to fix. But in the absence of that, let me throw it open to 5 or 6 or 7 observations. What, from your point of view, from where you sit in the world, what's the violence that you want peace to come to?
Stop armed conflict.
Excellent.
Economic justice.
Justice and its links to peace, and maybe injustice being part of a source of violence.
Being afraid of each other.
Ah, fear-mongering and fear and enemy creation.
Abuse of women.
3 out of every 4 victims in violent conflicts are women. Yes. What else?
Prevent displacement of people from their homes.
Highest people qualifying under the term international refugee now than ever since World War II. And the utter destruction of a nation before our eyes in Syria, where a nation that was 21 million has almost 1 million dead and 11 million displaced internally or externally. Unfathomable 5 or 6 years ago. Local violence? Yes?
Secular, I guess, acceptance.
Always ready for those 2 or 3 murders that come in the evening news or dominate the front page. Maybe even the entertainment value of murder in our culture, or various things. That's a tall order, put all those together. I don't want to trivialize or even compare those, because each in their own right are so problematic and deeply felt in different groups' human experience that each of them is the subject of lots of study, action, and possibilities. But what I ask your indulgence or patience in this evening is, for the purpose of our discussion, I'm going to use that array of things that you've all offered, knowing that each of them is deep and intricate and painful, and say, while being depressed and stunned by that level of categories of violence that we see operate in the world, I'd like us to try to, without being insensitive, to pull that inside out and say, well, if there's that many different types of terrible violence with all of its dimensions, from fear-mongering to societal, economic injustice to armed conflict, maybe there's a route for me as an individual citizen to find the type of violence that I think needs to be worked on, because there's so many of them. And I'm looking for a route for how to do that, how to make a bit of a difference in certain kinds of ways. Because I want to make an argument tonight and share with you that I think there are opportunities for us making bits of difference, whether you're 20 or 75 years old. And I think part of that comes to an understanding a little bit about where we are in the challenges of peace and the opportunities that are there, that I know we teach professionals at the graduate level, but we don't, certainly in my class of folks, that is academics, talk enough with real people and real audiences about those opportunities. So I'd like us to file the reality that its own 5-day seminar could be exploring the depths and dimensions and linkages across the violence that you've shared with us, and go to a second step of a challenge. And that is to get to peace in many areas, particularly if we picked out the 21 or 22 really high-profile violent armed conflicts that are going on these days. If we were able to assemble a peace conference for Syria or a Congo or a Ukraine and have it actually produce a peace agreement or a peace accord, the data of history over the last 30 years tells us that only half of those accords really still hold, and the other half fall victim to violence within the first 5 years. It's so hard to get a peace that comes about among all the ceremonies of the toasting of the champagne, etc., and the signing and the photo ops, etc., to get it to still be lasting after 5 years. That's one of the most depressing findings for those of us who try to do peace research. Do we know the ingredients that not only get an agreement formed, but create it to be a just and lasting and viable peace? This is why I think attention of anybody in the US now ought to be to our good cousins from Colombia, who tried, and at least successfully to now, in the first 6 months, are ending a 54-year-old war. And this particular war is one that has tried in its 300 pages of agreement to cover so many of the reasons as to how peace before breaks down, in the hope that they don't fall victim to that and try to accommodate that. So cheer for the Colombians, or find a way to link with the Colombians if you can, because that'll deal with the second challenge. All peace, I think, is local. Whether you're in Crimea, or whether you're in the streets of Venezuela today, where a couple 100,000 people came out saying enough of a government that's impoverished us and thrown our journalists in jail and killed union leaders, or even if it's in our own communities, which we know is dominated by the secularization and antiseptic treatment of violence. So when we think about where can I be in the world to assist peace, think about how your own local community might link with other communities. Or think about who's in your community who's especially vulnerable to the changes and challenges that are going on now with regard to fear mongering and other dimensions. I'm going to focus with us on the last two, because I think those are the ones most not often heard in communities. They relate to some material we had you pick up at as you entered, and there's still other copies there if you need it. We usually, if you will, the general understanding of peace is we've got to resolve these conflicts. We got to sit down, you trade a little bit of this, enemy number one trades their enemy across the table, this set of things, and the trading and mediation and negotiation, finally you get to a peace. I want to make an argument that's made by some of my good colleagues and a lot of good professionals in the field that conflict resolution may have very well served us as a good device for bringing peace in the 20th century. But in the 21st century, where so many of our conflicts have their roots in injustice and in other places, we've got to move beyond horse trading because some of the people at the table don't own any horses. And some of the other folks at the table have been involved in perpetrating the war because they're war profiteers of a very distinct kind. The reason, whether even if they're ISIS, they took control of the land they did is because it would generate resources. So in Congo, look at the militias who took over the gold mines. Look at the folks in Angola, Sierra Leone, various other countries that took over the diamond fields. So I think the term is appropriately used, the rape of countries and the resources that extract them. When you bring those scoundrels to the table and they say, I agree to the peace, they may have their fingers crossed behind their back, because if peace comes with the rule of law and comes with the operation of a fair economic system, that doesn't work for them. So they kind of ruin the peace shortly after it begins, because they're criminals, they're not political actors. So we've got to get to something beyond conflict resolution, we've got to get to conflict transformation. And lastly, I think it was true even in World War I and World War II, but not nearly as pronouncedly able to be mobilized now with the 20 plus wars going on in the globe, that we need to build linkages between those who are in their country trying to build peace and those outside the country who are committed to help them for either just reasons of goodwill, but may actually have lots of expertise to bring to bear to them. May be able to introduce them to new resources. May be able to maximize the interconnected world we have, which can link us in a fingertip to folks in Cartagena trying to build peace curriculums that they'll put and link their schools with their libraries with. That's the kind of connection I want to maximize. I was a good shortstop once, but that was an error right there. There we go. So, if I had to provide a general framework for what can all of us as ordinary citizens be working on, what can ordinary people do to push for more peace in our time, peace not only for the United States being secure and committed to peace, but peace in many other areas, I think they operate in three broad realms. The first is structural, the second is attitudinal, and the third is transactional. By structural, well, think about buildings, think about things that take a long while to construct. In order for the system of peace to work, let's say in those conflicts that are loaded with injustice and with marauding militias and governments extracting resources unfairly from their country folk, we need structural changes in how international trade works, in how you and I go to a jewelry store and ask whether or not that diamond is certified from the Kimberley process so it's a fair trade diamond. What other resources, what other natural minerals should we be asking that of now? And there's a whole host of them, including the things that are built into your computers. How do we find ways to make changes in rules, in institutions, and in the way that political and social groups deal with each other in our communal life that changes our ways of doing things. You know, institutions, we're told by the sociologists, get created because they're a responsive structure to human needs. Well, where's the responsive structure to human needs of this incredible refugee crisis? What's very, very clear is that the UN agencies, the regional agencies, for all the strength of the European Union in many ways, had absolutely no capacity because they had no vision of what was going on and how bad it might get. I sat with a colleague at a conference a couple of weeks ago who cut his teeth for 17 years at Catholic Relief Services doing refugee work, then went to USAID, then was been in academic life for about a dozen years. And I knew he had been asked to go to Greece and to inspect refugee camps. And he said, George, I've been through a lot of bad things, Palestine, Bangladesh, etc. This is the worst I've ever seen it. I'm having nightmares. You know, this is a hardened international civil servant. He said, we have to change the structures. We have to change the structure by which we not only define what a refugee is, we've got to get away from the fear and labeling, and we've got to create new ways of dealing with problems like this. So, the first question I pose to citizen groups is, what structures do you want change? What structures are you part of? What structures are not part of the problem, but might have resources? Government is one of the big ones.
National structure needs to change.
There you go. The theme that holds us together somehow as if boundaries were sacred. And on and on. How many of us belong to churches? Churches are some of the greatest international agencies around. How many of you might belong to the United Nations Association of the USA? Various people. I think if you did an inventory of the voluntary things that you either write a check to each year out of the goodness of your heart or your interest, or the things you're connected to, you might be in a place to argue in that structure for structural change. And you certainly, as a citizen, might be able to say, wait a minute, whether it's a immigration policy or a national security policy, or whether or not my local newspaper is providing enough articles to us about some of the terrible crises, how do I work in the structures I have contact with for structural change? Secondly, attitude change. Attitudes are becoming increasingly polarized in our own communities and countries. You know, we're a live and let live democracy, and that's one of our virtues. But at the same time, when we have this much discord locally, with as much discord as going on internationally, discord with destruction, we may need to meet and talk and meet and talk and meet and talk with people with whom we disagree. And we may need to think about giving a little, whatever your persuasion on these issues, giving a little backbone to leadership by saying, look, you're the head of this organization for a reason. You're my congressperson for a reason. You're the people who are editors of this newspaper for a reason. You're the principal of the high school for a reason. You're a thought leader. Where's the thinking? We're setting up the conditions under which people thinking differently can talk and work it out and both grow by learning from one another. Where's the areas of engagement for the things that we think reflect our best values? So part of what I'm urging a lot of communities to do is to think about, where do you want attitude change? If you think there's incredible invisibility to injustice or to violence, how do we give visibility to those with a human face that doesn't generate fears but generates empathy? And from empathy and people meeting and talking, let them create the actions that changes some attitudes and maybe changes some structures. And that leads, I think, to thinking about transactional changes. How do we find a way in the world in which local and global is intensely connected to make those connections have more and more difference for the reduction of violence, for the creation of more justice, for de-enemizing, if you will, doing away with the fear and the enemy making, when the enemy may in fact be more a function of our own perceptions than it is that reality. So, what change can ordinary people do? I think these three types are critical. I mentioned one of the key points is moving from conflict resolution to conflict transformation. I'm not going to go through each of these rubrics, but my good colleague and friend John Paul Lederach, kind of what I would say is the great international Mennonite peace builder of our time, has created a framework in which he says, look, there's limits to conflict resolution. It's important, but it usually works only when you're sitting down among equals. It tries to take one particular problem, negotiate it, go to the next problem, figure it out, go to the next problem, figure it out, and say 1 + 1 + 1 there equals 3. And it does nothing about the relationship between the contending parties. And we need a process that builds new relationships. Because if you've been engaged in systematic violence for a long while, the violence has already changed you. It often makes you more hardened in your positions, more hateful of the other. And to think that somehow you can just go to a table and because you killed my brother and I killed your brother, then let's figure out how we're going to build a peace accord without addressing the nature of the hurt, the pain, the hatred, and the lack of a shared social fabric or a shared social vision, it doesn't work. So we need the process of resolution to be focused on a horizon for change in building new relationships. The key to the Colombian process that I think makes it unique relative to the Congo or the Philippines or elsewhere is that they began with the notion that 54 years of this terrible conflict can't be ended by a piece of paper and the rebels coming in and laying down their arms. It can only be ended if we ask the question, what does the new Colombia look like? And how do enemies bind together in communities to create that new Colombia, not because we forget what happened, and even not because we forgive it, but because we want our grandchildren to live in peace. And in order to do that, you and I, as fighting enemy, have to build a new relationship. Otherwise, those grandchildren don't have a chance to live in a world of full peace. There's a second page on the back of this, which is what this means for personal relationships that I invite you to examine, because it gets partly to those structural changes and the transactional changes that I talked about. In a sense, that's your homework after we're finished this evening, to look at that and see if it helps as a useful guide. Dixie mentioned I spent some time at the U.S. Institute of Peace. This is what we called in our public dialogue the Lifecycle of Conflict. People often say to me, this peace building thing it's just too big for me. I'm not made up for this in any way, shape, or form. I'm not a trained diplomat, etc. This interesting dimension of how a conflict unfolds, and this kind of parabola, if you went from here and drew a line up through ceasefire, everything on the left-hand side is the usual understanding of diplomacy. Prevent the outbreak of war. Let's say we're right there at crisis diplomacy right now with the North Koreans. We are somewhere on the line between peacemaking and crisis diplomacy with the Iranians because of the contribution of the nuclear agreement. We've moved from routine diplomacy to maybe crisis with the Russians. Okay? But who are the people in charge of that? They're the high-level decision makers. Okay? The problem that we didn't address until I think the last decade is that once that diplomacy breaks down and is unsuccessful and war breaks out, and war lately means all hell breaks loose in many places and has its own reverberations back to us in one way or another, even if we're not involved in fighting in the conflict. What happens is then we hit the second slope here, where maybe the UN and other groups go in and they do peacekeeping, they do peace enforcement, but the biggest dilemma is how do you in fact build and ensure that peace so it's not one half of the conflicts that deteriorate back and recidivist back into violent conflict. And that lower right-hand side of the diagram has become a big focus for some of us. It says in that big diagram, these are the tasks that we need. We need everything from war crimes accountability to truth and reconciliation commissions, to human rights implementation, to managing post-war trauma among children and adults and former armed forces officials, and on and on. Let's get to work at that. But it was always seen at the start as that too is a function of government. And I think the history plays out to show that in the world we live in, since the late 1990s, that plays out not as a function of government, but it plays out in very important roles. We need religious peace builders from many different walks of belief and denomination in their clerical status, in their leaders as community people, to apply what the best of their religion tells them about reconciliation. We need educators, those of you who are 4th grade or 7th grade or senior high teachers, to think about what can we do to help a school system that has to be put together either in Palestine or in Syria or in Congo to reconstruct a school system where the textbooks don't lock in the patterns of history and hate that have traditionally led those people to engage in violence. Sometimes somebody asks me in a radio broadcast, who do you think is the #1 peace builder you've seen in the last decade? And I say it's the commission that rewrote the Palestinian textbooks in the occupied territories because it finally got the contested territory stuff correct, and that Israelis weren't singularly to blame and need to be hated for the rest of your life as a Palestinian child. They're the peace builders, the folks who wrote the new curriculum. Healthcare professionals. You have some stories in CNN and elsewhere about the incredible Syrian doctors who stayed on the scene. But every hospital in Syria, which was the #1 Middle Eastern country for healthcare in the entire Middle East, is devastated. Who's going to reconstruct that? And how are they going to help? Police. You know, one of the biggest differences between Western society, and I know this is a sensitive topic in our own culture now because we're looking at police reform, and you have reports that I heard about on the radio coming up about Grand Rapids, and you know who gets stopped on the highway and who doesn't, and who gets profiled and who doesn't. You know, all of that's right on our own skin as Americans right now, right? But I will tell you that if you want to keep peace in a country that's been at war, we need to train police like Western police. We need to have them understand that your life doesn't operate from bribery, from people you can catch and let go, or people you can intimidate without any belief in the rule of law. We need social workers, we need artists, we need healers for the young in many, many different ways. In that, and in the search for that, and wondering how much it was operating, a couple of my very talented colleagues at the Kroc Institute said, look, we've been giving out master's degrees since 1987. We've got almost 500 graduates. We think that that list of tasks at the end tail of the diagram may be what's happening out there in the field, but let's survey our graduates. And we got back all of these responses, and I'm always compelled to share it with audiences like you, because in this big peace wheel, as we call it, the 3 big categories are structural and institutional change, justice and healing, and violence prevention and conflict transformation. But when we began just counting the individual responses, we said, aha, within each of those categories, there's some wider and more analytically clear types of work. Everything from, yes, we still need dialogue and conflict resolution strategies, But we also need, as part of conflict transformation, people who understand how to do nonviolent change, because you're always going to have difficulties after violence ends with the disagreements. But the thing that doesn't change now that you've been to peace is that change doesn't come out of the barrel of a gun. It comes out of the ballot box. It comes out of the nonviolent protest. It comes out of the hunger strike, if that's what it needs to be. Nonviolent change training is critical. We can't do this without humanitarian action, transitional justice from human rights lawyers and specialists, restorative justice. You know how many recommendations from the Department of Justice over the last 3 years to local communities has been teenage first offenders that are not violent first offenders don't need to be thrown in jail. They need programs of restorative justice. And when we began to dissect this more and read the responses of folks, we found out what's their particular jobs. And we kept learning this is what people are doing in their jobs, in their discrete jobs in each of these areas. So when somebody comes to me and says, I want to work for like peace and justice, how do I do that? What might I do? Well, you could become a trauma therapist, because either with refugee communities that are settling in your own town, or going overseas to do this, or doing counseling that leads you to research about what happens to traumatized children and how you recommend therapies for others, all of that's available. We went to the other section of the wheel and tried to look at what do people do discreetly there. And we found out an array of interesting jobs that just keep showing us the linkage between what somebody might be trained for in the United States and decide I'm going to apply it in my local community to help bring either peace to the local community or to extend it internationally. And then for the last section, of course, the same thing happened. Those who work to change structures and institutions and dealing with these dynamics. You have the Kroc website as a list here. You can go to our website and look at the Kroc wheel and find all these things. And we're pretty proud of this. Before I stop and take questions, the second part of homework I would give to us, beyond looking at the two-sided thing about conflict transformation, is where do you fit on the wheel? Are you somebody who's going to, at this stage of life, give a lot of advice and do connections between various things and be an inspirer? Are you somebody who's with an organization where you in fact already do think globally and act locally? Or do you want to start taking that on in whatever volunteer or work life you have? Or do you want to, for a while, take an inventory on what I think is unique that builds us the possibility of insiders and outsider linkages? Is we now live in a world, what I would call without borders. Not without borders because of internet or TV or travel, but we have people who see themselves without borders. How many folks have heard of Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, right? That's the first one that sort of came to our recognition about a decade ago for what they're doing. How many people know about Engineers Without Borders? Pure water and all sorts of other things. Teachers Without Borders. I got a letter from a student about 1.5 years ago, very proudly announcing he was with Clowns Without Borders. See, look at that. Makes every audience laugh. And you know what he's doing with it? He's doing trauma healing in refugee communities. Right? All of his friends laughed at him when he was making money on Saturdays being Ronald McDonald at the local McDonald's to earn a little money to get through Notre Dame. It came out that way. There is a network of A to Z guide to the world without borders, in which you and I can go and scroll down and see descriptions of any number of things, beginning with Artists Without Borders to Zoologists Without Borders. And one of the reasons I love talking about that with communities that have the kind of age dynamic that we have is, if you talk to a U.S. Peace Corps director right now, they would say the largest cohort of applicants they have that's also most attractive to them are folks between 52 and 70. My college students hate that because you're pushing them out of going to Peace Corps. But guess what? Those people who are between 52 and 70 are giving their time because they've been a kind of success in their life and they can afford the time. They can give the time. But they're also what? Nutritional nurses, pediatric doctors, architects, civil engineers, or somebody who's just got a hobby that can be really helpful to install 20,000 toilets in a place which is finally getting running water. So we have this opportunity in U.S. society to be part of this interesting world without borders of linking insiders in the conflict who have needs with us outsiders who have talent and resources.
I'll give it up.
All right. And while we're getting it up, maybe I should say thank you, and the floor is open, and let's have some questions, challenges, and things like that. Please.
Just in a very general way, one of the things I'm having the most difficulty with right now is maintaining a sense of hope. And I'm not a religious person, so if you could answer the question without putting a religious tinge on it, what can I do on a daily basis, or how can I teach my brain to think without giving up hope?
Thank you. How many people share that view, that feeling sometimes?
Repeat the question.
That is, the question is, look, I'd like to know, because I'm struggling, the biggest difficulty for me now, I'm thinking about all of this, is I'm having trouble maintaining hope. Okay? And some people will derive that from faith perspectives, but a lot of people have to necessarily turn to their faith for that, especially if you're someone who says, look, I have a certain kind of way of life that, that's not what I do. I think hope comes with more and more information about the areas where organizations and people are making a difference. Hope comes from your own decision to find a place where you can make a difference, whether that's a local neighborhood kit, whether it's volunteering at a school that's trying to expand its cross-cultural tolerance, whether it's deciding you're going to get a little bit more out of one's comfort zone to meet and talk with people whose opinions I despise. Because I want them to be open to me, so I have to be open to them. I spent part of my co-curricular life as a soccer coach. And I remembered a 13-year-old coming in at halftime when we were losing 6-0 to the best team in the state, saying, Coach, there's no hope. And there's nothing like having a discussion among 13-year-olds. Well, how would we restore hope so we play a better second half? One of them said, Coach, why don't you get out and play? I said, no, that's not going to happen. That's fantasy, that's not hope. But I think we've got to talk with others about hope. I'm not going to get the name right. It was a very successful CNN person, primetime night woman, who decided to leave CNN in that capacity after 2 or 3 years and say, I'm going to become an independent journalist, and I'm going to look for the good things that are going on in the world, and I want to report good stories. I don't want to go from crisis to crisis, from murder to murder, etc. The world is bigger than that. And I'm sorry I forget her name, but I think that's very, very important for each of us to say, I'm not going to draw from somewhere or just wake up in the morning after taking a pill and saying, oh, today I have hope. That we're going to have to go out and find it and meet it and see people whose circumstances are worse than ours, that they continue to have hope and go on. I think there's hope in looking at the times when we've been at the brink of destruction and step back, either through just dumb luck or actually intentionality, and figure out how we mobilize those lessons of history, but especially how we mobilize the local stories of hope among people. It's a very important question.
And the mic isn't working, so if you could do just what you did.
Okay, good, I'll do that, yes. And are you waiting to,
I'm ready for you.
okay, let's just show a little bit of this so we can keep taking questions. Thank you.
I think you have to go to the very left and click on that button. That,
There you go, on a little circle.
You can put your cotton here. Experts from Acupuncturists Without Borders, or AWB for short, are back in Haiti with their 9th team. But this trip is different. Instead of treating as many people as possible in a few days or weeks, Julia, Doris, and Mark are placing the power in the hands of the Haitian people so that they may help themselves.
Everywhere that our teams have worked in the camps, they've all been asking about training. When are you coming? When are you going to come and train?
The treatments help people recover from the trauma of surviving a major earthquake so they can rebuild their lives. They also relieve pain. 5 tiny needles inserted in each ear, known as the NADA protocol, have a powerful effect.
If you go to Magic Unified, you don't need to see an old woman open. Just you would see just a little guy, a kid. Just tell him, can you tell me something about acupuncture or about needles? If you do that, then he would understand.
Louison Alcidi remembers people lining up for treatment at the Matthew 25 house, a guest house now turned into a field hospital and camp for the homeless. To answer the growing requests, AWB prepared a 4-day training workshop to teach locals the NADA protocol.
Part of the purpose of this lecture is so that you...
And I think what they're doing there is
how to describe
taking the modern version that you may have heard in other circumstances. You can give someone a fish and solve their hunger today, or you can train them to fish. Okay? You can come in as an expert and do this, or train them to do something, or join a team that provides resources that others can train. I was at University of Massachusetts at Lowell about a year ago, and a woman came up from the audience and said, I'm glad to hear you talk about this kind of stuff because I'm going back for my 3rd year in a row to Rwanda. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. What do you do? She said, I am a pediatric dentist. I said, oh, that's interesting. And she said, yeah, you know, they did very good, Doctors Without Borders and others, after the genocide, which, you know, is now 23 years ago, of bringing back hospitals and medical schools. Dentist people forgot about, and more importantly, child dentist people never understood. So I'm taking like 16 people in our little dental program, they're in their 2nd year, and saying we're going to go and we're going to train other people to be dental assistants for children so they can help the dentists that are there think more in terms of the needs of children. Pretty inventive and simple.
Question to a specific region here, North Korea, and I think you called it shared fabric, or later on some pathways. What do you see with North Korea and seemingly the rest of us for this shared fabric?
The question is, given the shared fabric that I talked about and the things on the wheel, what's our likelihood of being able to do this and operate this in North Korea? You know, sometimes there's a case that's so far outside the field and outside the choice of what works most of the places, most of the time. You have one. My fear is that North Korea, in the short term, is that place. One of my responsibilities at the UN panel of experts, in addition to looking at where people hid money to make this thing go for them in the North, was that I dealt with all the humanitarian agencies who went in to study what was going on in North Korea. Very few Westerners ever get in, but UNICEF, World Health Organization, Food and Agricultural Organization were always able to go in every year and monitor what was going on. And I remember them coming back in March of 2011 and having a session with them behind closed doors. And they said, this is a country where the folks between the ages of about 8 or 9 and 16 have the highest percentage of malnourishment in the globe. even beyond the notion of famine, like we see it in Africa, said one of them, and the mental deficiencies are compounding. The carrying capacity of that country is going to be limited. And unfortunately, there's going to be very little we can do except at some time in the future establish care systems. So I'm pretty depressed about North Korea in terms of the people. But I also don't want all of those people killed by a nuclear exchange between Western powers and the people in Korea. I think this is one of those places where hope is tested, okay? Tested very, very strongly. I don't think there's a lot outsiders can do at this stage. I think we're going to need a structural change at the top, which is different from just saying, why doesn't somebody put a bullet in that leader's head? Because the leadership is all of one particular kind of mind. And I'd like to think that as the older leadership dies off, there's more international consciousness. I know there is, in part because of the sneaky cell phones that some of these people have and they use regularly. But it's the worst pattern of progressive change I think we'll ever see in the 20th or 21st century. North Korea is 50 years away from being on this wheel, I fear. A hopeful sign would be 25 or 30.
See, one of the biggest problems is we see so much violence. The people group that's in here, my generation, we've seen it from the Vietnam War through now with a very short window where we've had no mass killings, no wars. We see it on TV, we see it on social media. We're desensitized to it. We see it in Chicago. 500 plus murders in Chicago. We don't care anymore. How do we beat this desensitization? How do we become sensitized again? How does the next generation become sensitized to violence and peace so we understand that they're not mutually exclusive? I mean, you can have peace, you don't have to have violence. How does the next generation get sensitized?
I'm going to need help from those of you in the room who are child psychologists, but I know some ways that the sensitization of violence can partly be done. We can't stop our teenagers from going to Fast and the Furious movies and all the rest of that. That's a battle many people don't want to have with their teenage kids or their grandchildren at that level. But that doesn't mean that after the movie is over, we can't talk about, now, what does that really mean? You know, I once asked in a Notre Dame class, because I knew I had a student who grew up in the same neighborhood I grew up in, Brooklyn, New York, and there were 75 students in this class. I said, okay, we're going to talk a lot about violence. How many of you have personally seen somebody murdered before you were 12 years old? And the only two people who raised their hands was that young man and myself from growing up in Brooklyn, New York. And I said, once you've seen somebody murdered in cold blood, you don't do Hollywood murder anymore in an antiseptic way. Once you hear somebody screaming on a street, it changes you, unless you don't let it change you, unless you don't feel. And we talked a lot about desensitization. The first step is not necessarily bringing young people to a place where they can see other people murdered, but it's the same kids that we put to bed at night who love their pet have to extend the love of the pet to the love of the neighbor next door that just punched them in the nose or stole their bike. And I think, at least in middle-class America, and I'll claim blame for this as well in raising children, we don't place enough investment in them because we're so worried of ruining our young people that we're not willing to expose them to certain things that the rest of us were just exposed just in the course of growing up in this society. You know, we want to create that bubble for them where there's no failure, there's no violence, there's no various things like that until they do service work for their college or their high school or their church, and they go visit a neighborhood for a while where that's regular fare, and they romanticize about it, but then they come home. I think you got to rub shoulders with people who face blood all the time. Yes?
First of all, I want to thank you for coming to join us. I think that as you're speaking, one of the words, and you mentioned it before in your speech about empathy, that learning to walk in somebody else's shoes. So in other words, with the desensitization, whatever the pronunciation is, but rather, you know, you ask the person, well, how would it feel for you? Imagine if it were someone close to you to be terribly injured. And one of the things that's very interesting to me is I think that what is lacking oftentimes in our discussion about violence and empathy and desensitization is the historical foundations on which this country has been built. And until we can look that square in the eye, I do believe that we can talk about Palestine, we can talk about Israel, but it's the same thing. And there are repercussions to that, and it's a huge challenge. And so my question to you, and you know, working at Notre Dame and the Peace Institute, I would imagine that if you consider Notre Dame and where the university is located, it is certainly on indigenous land.
Yeah,
Would you agree that that would be an important part of the discussion? And if so, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Notre Dame isn't singular in this. I think the lead institution doing this well is probably Georgetown right now, right? You're looking at Georgetown bringing in all the identifiable people they could find who are the descendants of the slaves on which they built this, et cetera, et cetera. Notre Dame has a historic, I don't think it's a treaty, but an agreement with the Potawatomi tribe about Potawatomi Indians being able to come and Native Americans being able to come to school at Notre Dame under certain conditions, et cetera. It doesn't help the living to that historical circumstances that shortly after the people who got there first to build the university saw a large migration for which they weren't responsible of Potawatomi much more to the northern regions and out of that central Indiana area. In other words, I don't want the university to pretend it's doing justice to people to whom they haven't actually done an injustice, but they had a circumstantial relationship with. It's just my own bias. But I do think that, well, three things. One, at the top level, of all the wonderful things, excuse my personal bias, that Michelle Obama did for us, is reminding people that she lived in a house built by slaves. Leadership of bringing that to the fore, that we must have it in our consciousness. The second level are the people who design curriculum and teach them as teachers. And you have to ask the question, even if you're forced by a school system to teach certain kinds of ways, is to ask your students, is that all there is? And what else can I bring to it as a teacher? What else can I ask of my curriculum committee in my child's middle school that I know is important as inclusive reality of why we stand where we stand in an upper middle class community? What made that possible, and how is my student learning that, not just in my home, but out of sharing it with others? And the third area is, how do I find ways, if they exist? I'm a descendant of something. Native Americans and descendants of slaves are also descendants. Do we have things to talk about? You know, Guilford College and University of North Carolina in Greensboro have built their peace and justice programs around the historical reality of Greensboro and the white-black tensions, opportunities, the creation maybe of the civil rights movement right there in Greensboro. Those are the kinds of things that I think colleges and universities probably need to do.
We have time for one last question.
Yikes.
With all the shit, how can we expect a stable global peace when our leaders constantly change? You know, Obama said with Iran is going to do this. Trump comes along and says no, it's going to do this. Some of the other countries, once their leadership changes,
Question is, how can we expect to build stable peace if leadership always changes? My response to that would be, let us not fall victim to the belief that peace only comes from the top down and from leadership. or in particular, I don't want to march us to a layer of cynicism, but that the most peaceful leaders in the world are those whose population gave them no choice. But when a leader decides to jump up on the soapbox and say, do you know why you're losing jobs? Do you know why you're doing this? Do you know why you're doing that? It's because of those damn French, or the damn Germans, or the communists, or these people. And all the regular people salute to that, or say, it's a bunch of whatever, but I'm not going to get involved. That's when the leaders lead us to war. And the leaders jump up on the soapbox and say, let us be at peace, usually after all the political space for being at everything except peace is gone. So if we're privileged enough, as we are in this room, to live in a democracy, whatever our current feelings about certain aspects of that democracy, we have to maximize that. Whether that's you saying to your congressperson, I don't want to see a U.S. use of force abroad until there's an authorization of Congress every single time. Let's bring that back from our Constitution. Or whether it's you joining War Resisters League or Amnesty International through these interconnected networks. How are we pushing the notion that peace doesn't come from the barrel of a gun, but from the sensible arguments of people getting together in a world of declining and unequally distributed resources? And by the way, you can make your society or country great again in many ways besides military might. And to that, there is a corollary. Great empires have often fallen from power not because they were militarily weak, but because they were out of touch with the world in which they lived. And that's our greatest danger in our culture. That we don't understand the way the interconnections work, and that we can be leaders in that without it costing us, but with in fact having a growing pie and a sensible pie for all. Thank you very, very much.
I wish we could continue the conversation. Oh, wait, you can. Kathy Bath over on the right, she is going to be at the Cascade Roadhouse to continue this discussion on peace. It's something that we do after all of our programming. Just very fun, relaxed environment. No cost, just simply pay for refreshments. So. And we have a lot of upcoming events at the World Affairs Council, so if you are not already connected with us through our email notifications, please do stop by on your way out the door at our membership desk, and we're happy to chat with you. Now, I want to just let Lindsay Dorfman, the Director of Branch Services and Operations, say a few last words.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez, for a very informative and thought-provoking lecture. I'm actually kind of thinking in the back of my head about how I can start a librarians without borders. So here at the Kent District Library, we love to provide unique learning opportunities that bring people together, just like tonight. And for that, we are so thankful to partner with the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan to bring the Give Peace a Chance series. So thank you, Erica and Dixie, for all that you have done to organize the series. Next week is the final lecture in the series. It's going to take place here at the Cascade branch. It will start at 6:30. It's on Thursday, April 27th. And you will hear from Dr. Frederick Pearson, and he will be discussing perspectives on peace in the new U.S. administration. So it should be a really good one. We hope to see you here next week, and bring a neighbor and bring a friend, because it is a very important topic. Thank you all for coming.